Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here to debut Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. Before we had Attack on Titans, we had this. So, we are to go on and realize that there are like several different other versions of Attack of something. And so, we of course have things like Attack of the 50-Foot Cheerleader, Attack of the 50-Foot Cam Girl, which recently came out, Honey, I Blew Up the Kid, which of course is to be the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids like continuation in the series where you have the big baby movie. We have a movie called The War of the Colossal Beast, which I've never seen, which kind of seems interesting. And there, of course, had just been a plethora of different kinds of things where we would go on and have just these massive sized movies at certain points with unusual things like bunnies or cats and whatever, spiders, insects. Like that would normally be the usual thing to put out here. We also to find out that this movie was to get a remake at a certain point, which in all honesty, after I was to watch this movie, I was kind of really more intrigued by the remake. And so maybe at some point I'll go on and check that out as well as this, to have already seen this already. So, with that said, we, of course, are to do the one thing that would weaken this movie the most, is we don't spend enough time on the thing that is supposed to sell you on this movie, which is to be 50-Foot Woman. We really don't exactly get the thing that we're supposed to be sold on until almost the very end of the film. And I get that this movie is only an hour, but still. Again, me being to be more interested in the remake. So, we come to find before we have Nancy, who becomes larger than life, we have her, of course, have a problem with her husband because her husband is wanting to run off with some other woman and just be with Nancy because of her money. And so we come to find that Nancy is to be this drunk with, at some points, violent headaches. And so we have Nancy that is to already have problems before she even becomes this 50-Foot Woman. And we have her, for the way of which that she becomes large is because she was to go on and to have seen this unusual thing that at certain points they call it a red fireball, then they call it a satellite, and we would just have to really draw the conclusion that it's an alien ship. And so, with that said, when Nancy, it seems, is to get to interact with this alien ship, the alien ship wants something from her. And that in turn makes Nancy a 50-Foot Woman. And so we then have Nancy, who goes on to wreak havoc by the end of the movie, to, of course, go after Harry. So, like, this could also be fairly similar to King Kong in a lot of ways, because it's, without the whole Empire State Building thing and the airplanes and all that stuff, it's pretty dang close. So, with that said, like, I feel like this is a bad movie that I did enjoy. So, I don't know, I just liked it. I just wanted to just so badly just want to just, like this movie, even though, like, the best thing about it is it's only an hour. So, with that said, where can you go on and see this movie? Or at some point find the remake? I, of course, have gone on to an app called Zelifonic. Zelivonic. Zelivonic. Zelifonic. So, check that out to see the very first Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. and go on to also go into other bootleggish apps that I've reviewed through the long stretch of time that I've been here. You might need to go through a Google search rather than a Google Play Store search, but at some point you might go on and like search through Google Play Store the word movie apps, and you might find a lot of bootleggish like things that you can go on and find a number of things for absolutely free. I would recommend apps like Yes Movies, or there of course would be uh, apps like Vidlesy, Vidlesy, that is fairly similar to this one. There is to be certain stuff that you might have to Google search, like Movie Playbox or 123 Movies or Yes Movies and all these kinds of things. There's a number of different apps that you can dare, in fact, hopefully find Attack of the 50-Foot Woman and all the other ones that I just rattled off and mentioned for absolutely free. So with that said, I think it's about that time to just go into spoilers about this one, to just kind of rush through it. So hopefully the rush part will probably not be a mistake. And so with that said, let's go on and let's just double fire this bad boy up, because I think it's about that time again to, of course, go into spoiler time. Spoiler time, it's about that time again to spoil this movie. So yeah, I said this movie was bad, but I did get enjoyment out of it. And it didn't have a bad runtime. It was like, nah, like, I can go on and see something else if I wasn't satisfied with this. Nah, like, wasn't too bad. So, in the beginning of this film, we have the news anchor from KRKR TV who is telling us there is reports of multiple sightings of a red fireball all across the world. So, and he is to naturally assume from which the path of which that this thing is to take, that it should be making its way to California soon. And so we all of a sudden have Nancy, who is driving her car and is to all of a sudden be seemingly face to face or spaceship to car to this fireball like object. So immediately when Nancy is to see this thing, she immediately screams, "It's a fireball!" Why are you screaming? You don't even know what it is? It's not even a menacing looking thing. You're just, ha! Why? So, when Nancy gets out of her car to look at this thing, we have this giant hand that reaches out to her as she runs. She runs away. So, we have Honey who is making, we have Harry that's making out with a woman named Honey at this place called the Tony Club. And we have Honey who is kind of pulling away from Harry, like stating, it's like, well, hey, hey, you do have a wife, remember? And Harry is to say, it's like, well, the only reason why I'm with her is because of her money. And Harry couldn't get a cent from her because, like, that's Nancy's control over him. So Honey suggests, it's like, well, if Nancy were killed, then Harry could get Nancy's money then. And we have Harry kind of looking around. It's like, you know what you're saying? Like, you know what you're suggesting? He can't believe it. So, but then Harry is to go on and, like, rationalize. It's like, well, like, Nancy was in a mental hospital once, and she used to have violent headaches, and also she's a drunk. She probably still is. Until a doctor was to try and help her out and give her treatments, but, like, she still possibly could have the violent headaches from time to time, especially when she gets drunk. So Honey tells Harry, like, well, hey, just keep going on and playing doctor until we can figure out a way to commit your wife and throw away the key. And immediately that scenario quickly comes up as Nancy is screaming into town for Harry as the deputy grabs Nancy. The sheriff tells the deputy to, like, get Harry, while the sheriff is going to try to calm Nancy down. The sheriff is to immediately mention, like, well, hey, Nancy, like, maybe we should get some coffee. And Nancy's like, I'm not drunk, I'm sober. I'm not as thick as you drunk I am, officer. No, she's completely sober. And so Nancy starts to explain what she saw as she realizes no one would really believe her, but she doesn't care. She's like, I saw what I saw. Seesaw. So, Sheriff wants her to tell her, like, back up and just be like, okay, tell me every bit of this. Help me really understand what happened. Go on and have me reread the script if that's what we need to do. So, Deputy Charles tries to get Harry, and Harry pays the deputy off, like, gives him a cool, like, probably $10 bill, like, hey, skedaddle, like, and tells him some story about, like, hey, just tell the sheriff that I grabbed a cab and I'm gone. So the deputy tells the sheriff that Harry already drove off, and so we have the sheriff that's like, oh, okay, all right. So the sheriff is to go on and tell the deputy to get this this riot gun, and the sheriff, the deputy, and Nancy are all going to go to the spot that Nancy was to have sighted this thing, this flying satellite, and this 30-foot giant. And so we have the deputy that's like, oh, okay, so he goes back, gets the gun, and he comes back, he's like, wait a minute, 30-foot giant? Oh, man. So it's like, what a weird reaction. Like, just kind of like a thing that just doesn't, like, I don't really quite buy, but it is what it is. So they find Nancy's car and not anything else. So Nancy says it was in the middle of the road, and they're like, okay, here. So the deputy is talking to the sheriff while they're walking away from Nancy, and so the deputy's like, well, like she's crazy, right? And the sheriff is like, well, hey, like, she pays well enough more of taxes than anybody else does. So, like, hey, we're just going to play along here. So the deputy and the sheriff are to spread out, and they still find nothing. Nancy says the giant was reaching for her diamond necklace, and the sheriff tells Nancy that, well, hey, like, that diamond necklace is pretty valuable. Any drifter would go on and want to try to, like, steal that, you do realize. And after Nancy is to receive this lecture from the sheriff, she goes into her car and drives off because the sheriff and deputy are just to find nothing. So Deputy Charlie talks about how, like, Nancy is to drive off, like, so fast that it seems like she's going to drive off to the moon. Goofy thing. And so Charlie's talking to the sheriff also about Harry's obvious affair, that he had seen him, like, kind of, like, making out with another woman. With that woman. So we have the sheriff who's like, well, hey, like, we need to get out of here because we're not going to get paid overtime. Like, it seems like both the deputy and the sheriff just keep talking about overtime in this film. Like, that's the only, like, lines that they have in this film. I don't know what it is with the overtime with the sheriff and the deputy. So Nancy arrives home as she is met by Jess, her butler. Nancy gets a drink as Jess asks if there's anything more that she needs of him tonight. And Harry goes on to tell Jess, it's like, well, yeah, like, you can just leave. So Nancy doesn't like how Harry is treating Jess, and so Harry suggests, like, well, like, how about you go on and you marry Jess, and you just make me the hired help? Like, how about that? So Nancy tells Jess that that'll be all for the night, and she wants to also go on and tell Harry the same thing. Nancy knows that Harry's been around with another woman, as Harry just goes on and says, like, well, hey, like, I didn't lay a hand on that woman. What are you talking about? I'm not sure. Nancy calls Harry a gigolo and a parasite, and knows she only is to have him because of her money. And the only reason why Nancy is still holding on to Harry is because she loves him. Like, she just cannot, like, not be with this man. No matter what she does, she just is connected or whatever. So, and if Harry would just show one time that he really cared about her, she would go on and just, like, drop it like it's hot. Do whatever he wanted, like, give all of her money to Harry and whatever. But Harry just can no longer do that anymore. He's just off, running off with some young thing, if you know what I mean. So, Nancy tells Harry about the satellite and the giant with suspicions that maybe her diamond necklace had something to do about all this. And she also complains that the sheriff didn't believe her story, and Harry convinces Nancy to just, like, hey, like, you just need some rest, you just need to go to sleep, you've had a long night. And so he grabs her and he carries her up this flight of stairs. I'm like, man, that's a pretty strong man. Just up some stairs, like, man, like, I know for me, like, I'm, like, walking, like, down a flight of stairs and I need to, like, grab a railing because I'm just, like, my legs aren't that strong anymore. But anyway, so we have Harry carrying her up to bed. So Jess watches the conversation between both between both Harry and Nancy. And so he's like, all right, like, something's up here. So Harry gives Nancy sleeping medication and takes her diamond necklace without her knowing. So we all of a sudden have the deputy that is dancing with Honey until Harry appears. And so we have all of a sudden, like, Deputy Charlie that is going on of like, well, I was just about to tell Honey, like, Mon frere or hasta la vista or something like that, some kind of foreign way to say goodbye. And so Harry thought Honey would be at the hotel instead of at Tony's club. And we, of course, have Honey that's like, well, no, like, I was just, like, I wanted something to do. I was restless. So Harry plots with Honey about Nancy telling the story about the satellite and the giant. If only Nancy's doctor would go on and hear this story, this outlandish story, I'm sure this doctor would immediately want to commit Nancy. And so Harry tells Honey if she plays along with what they're doing, that he'll give her the diamond necklace in exchange. And so Honey's like, all right, like, I want me some of that necklace. So the following, I'm assuming this is the following morning, because why would this happen all in one shot? So we have Dr. Cushing that is telling Harry Nancy's suffering from mental exhaustion, and that also her drinking isn't helping any of it. So the doctor gives Nancy's medication to Jess, and Harry asked the doctor about, like, well, hey, like, she was saying this unusual, like, story the night before about this satellite and this giant, and we just have the doctor that plays it off as like, well, like, she was to have a very overworked imagination and hopes that that's not going to lead to her possible mental relapse. And because, of course, like, Nancy does not want to go back to that hospital, that she will probably die without Harry being with her, and the doctor hopes that there is some understanding there. So the doctor tells Harry he will be here for a few days. Nancy comes down the stairs and like, oh, my faithful husband, who is to have tried to commit me, I'm sure. Nancy asks Harry if the doctor called her crazy, and asks who even called the doctor. And Harry's like, well, yeah, I called him. And we, of course, have Nancy who's like, well, where were you last night? Huh? I wonder. Harry gives back Nancy's necklace. Jess tries giving Nancy this medication, and Nancy refuses the medication. All of a sudden, on the news, Nancy is hearing this report that I think is to be one that is probably just in Nancy's just head for some goofy reason. So we have the KRKR TV that is having news coverage on Nancy's satellite sighting. The anchorman continues on by stating that Nancy was to have not only had this satellite sighting, but also a 30-foot giant that might be a real benefit because of her recent feuding with her husband Harry. She might find a man out of this world for Nancy and could actually love her because of really how rich she is. There's not even a man that is to be an alien that couldn't resist a woman like that. So Nancy, who is listening to this report, is to be just so upset. I think she goes on, like, tosses a drink or is just really frustrated. Nancy wants herself to find the satellite, or she will have Harry just commit her, and then she's really and truly crazy. She goes to get this gun because she wants to hunt this thing down. And so Harry is to have to forcibly drive Nancy, as she is to have heard all of what Nancy has to have said about her. Like, hey, I'm going to grab this gun and we're going to get this. So Nancy and Harry are driving around. Nancy sees a flash and Harry doesn't see jack crap nothing. They then are to continue to just drive back, and Nancy finally sees the satellite or the spacecraft and runs toward it. Harry tries to stop her, but Nancy's already too far gone. Nancy has this giant hand that is continuing to try and touch her. Harry, after trying to shoot into this giant of a man, just gets in his car, drives crazily back home, packs this whole suitcase, and is to want to quickly leave. Jess wants to know what exactly happened and is punching and beating the crap out of Harry to get this information, to like hold on to him, try and like choke him and all kinds of things to try and keep him here so he'll confess what happened with him and Nancy. Jess calls the police afterwards as Harry is to get to Honey, and Harry tells Honey, like, hey man, like, we need to leave. Something weird just happened. So by the time that Harry makes it to the door, we have the deputy immediately there with, I think, some woman that I'm not quite exactly sure who she was. So maybe a landlord of sorts for Honey. So the deputy is to ask what Harry and Honey are doing together. And so the deputy tells Harry that the sheriff wants both Harry and Honey in his office right away. And so then the next thing we see is that the deputy, Harry, and Honey are in this office, and both Harry and the deputy are playing gin as Honey is, I think, like, reading this newspaper. So this is kind of taking a very long time. So the sheriff is is to now have a doctor making a checkup on Nancy, because somehow Nancy is now back at her place. So we have the doctor that tells the sheriff that this is really early and needs her to go to the hospital as soon as she can. And it seems that he is to notice that there are scratches upon her throat. So the deputy, Harry, and Honey make their way to Nancy's home as well as Harry's. And so Harry tries to go up to see Nancy, and the doctor is like, wait, no. Like, you can't go up there because we have certain suspicions that Nancy might have, like, radiation poisoning or could possibly be decontaminating, like, something of some sort. So, no, do not go up there. So, the sheriff now wants Harry's story. And so Honey immediately just kind of budges in, and she's like, well, like, Harry was with me the whole night. Sure he was. So the doctor is to go on and is to tell this nurse how much medication to exactly give Nancy. Like, hey, make sure you have this certain medication, or otherwise you're gonna give her a fatal dose. Honey is listening on as this doctor is stating this. So Jess tells the sheriff when Nancy wakes up, she can corroborate his story, and the sheriff tells Harry and Honey, it's like, well, hey, don't be leaving town anytime soon. So the sheriff tells the doctor of Jess's story, and the doctor is like, well, hey, I completely believe Jess. Like, he has been with Nancy since she was a little girl, and, like, I have complete faith that he's telling the truth. So Honey and Harry are to have kind of already left, and so they are to be driving. They stop at some point, and so they're coming up with this plan as Honey was to overhear the doctor. And so their plan is to try and overdose Nancy on the nurse's medication because it could be fatal and could kill off Nancy. So before Nancy can, like, wake up and tell her side of the story, and then Harry and Honey will probably be in trouble. So Harry goes back home, and so when the nurse is to fall fast asleep, Harry is to grab immediately for this medication and take it to Nancy's room. Come to find out, by the time that Harry gets there and the nurse is kind of quickly behind him, we find that Nancy is to now be a 50-foot woman. Not a 30-foot woman, because that's what often they state for these characters. Maybe at some point this movie was originally to be called Attack of the 30-Foot Woman, but they said, like, no, 50 sounds a little bit better. Maybe they didn't really rationalize the actual sizing of all things and whatever, what have you, until later on. Who knows? So we have the nurse, who, of course, is screaming like anytime you would see anything that's out of the ordinary. So we, of course, have the nurses like, well, hey, we need to alert the doctor. Like, this is very unusual. We could also really have these doctors who are to possibly rationalize what has happened to Nancy, because in all honesty, we do have this thing called giantism that is to be like this gland that is to go on and make people taller than what they actually should be. And so there, of course, are to be cases where certain people are to die because they can't handle, like, growth spurts and so on and so forth. So Like, I just find that to be rather interesting because, of course, I am an over 6 foot tall guy. So, like, yeah, that's to just be kind of like these interesting stories about these people who grew too tall. Anyways, so, and especially once I was to get to high school, like, I was evidently done growing, and there were actually guys who were much taller than I was. So I was like, oh, hey, yeah, like, that's cool that, like, every once in a while, I'm like, oh, hey, other tall guy, because there's very few of us. So, yeah. So, that would be always the fun thing in, like, schools. I'd have so many people, like, know who I am. I'm like, I have no clue who any of these random people are. And it would always just be this funny thing. Is like, how did that person know me? It's like, maybe it's just, like, I'm the tall guy, and so it's like, hey, do you know who that guy is? Yeah, it's so-and-so. Oh, okay. I never really quite understood that in schools. But hey, at least I wasn't to always be ever picked last in any sport because I was always the tall guy. So, score benefit for that, at least. So, moving on. So, we oddly the next day have this delivery man that is to deliver these unusual boxes, like a ton of chains and a elephant needle, and we have this delivery guy that is telling them exactly what all these boxes are. And for this guy to say that like, hey, here's all of your chains, like, he doesn't have like one real like question of like, hey, what are you doing with these chains? That's like, it seems like this guy is just like, meh, like, all right, like if they probably would have told him, like, that would have even been a worse off thing. And plus, why does this delivery man know what all the boxes are? That just seems weird. Unless, like, there's a lot of times you could probably like feel what a box is and just be like, oh, I know what this is. But like, I guess that would be like perfect if you were to be like getting a gift that you were being given. Why am I going to this dialogue? Because I can, and I will. So let's move. So, the doctors, because there's now multiple, there's now 2 of them now, they are contemplating surgery. And one of the doctors mentioned that Nancy's neck may have been irradiated or had gotten radiation poisoning. I would even go on to rationalize that maybe because of the necklace that Nancy had, maybe she had gotten some weird allergy that made her gigantic. That could be very weird, but there is also like some very odd allergies that people are to have. But hey, if you have a necklace that can make you big, then why does Ant-Man need to have a suit? That's for sure. Anyways, so Harry is to find out from these doctors that they're going to go on and possibly perform a surgery on Nancy to help her condition. And so Nancy goes on to tell Honey this. And so, because the doctors also need like Harry's approval to go on and do this procedure on Nancy, so it's like Harry could just kind of stonewall them, and Nancy could probably die from growing. I don't know. So Honey says that Harry and her have the same disease. The clap? No. I mean money. And they want to spend it. So, like, they're greedy as F, and they want to just blow the money. And so we have them realize that Nancy is in a coma, and Honey wants Harry to wait for her to just blow up. Like, if she gets any bigger, if she just keeps on growing, then maybe she'll just blow up. So the 2 doctors are taking Nancy's hand, and they're adjusting it with all these weird, goofy chains. As we have both the deputy and sheriff were kind of looking around at Nancy's house. And when they're kind of continuing to look around, they all of a sudden notice this footprint, this massive footprint. And so the sheriff even gets like Jesse over here, like, hey man, like, footprint, like, you're here all the time. Like, what is this about? So they're like, so they're kind of even drawing conclusions like, well, like, is Nancy really in this coma, or is she still like, is she faking it? What's going on? So what the sheriff and deputy decide to do is that the sheriff wants the deputy to go to the office to just kind of hang out there, and both the sheriff and Jess are going to take his car, the sheriff's car, and just follow these footprints to wherever they lead. So, yeah, like, I finally figured out how to talk about that point, because, like, what the heck am I even saying here? So, both Jess and the sheriff follow these footprints, even at certain points getting, like, kind of stopped along the way. And they go on to find the alien spaceship, which I'm stopped to call it a satellite or red ball of fire or whatever, to now call it an alien spaceship, because these characters are going to go inside this thing. So, now it's an alien spacecraft. Now it makes a lot more sense. Both Jess and Sheriff find the satellite, and they both are to take guns in there because they don't know what to expect. The sheriff concludes that Harry left Nancy out here, and the giant had to have brought her back somehow. So, Jess finds an empty gun and makes their way to the ship. While both Jess and the sheriff are kind of looking around, we have Jess that is to grab the sheriff by the shoulder and scare him. And so Jess is to tell the sheriff, like, hey, like, come back here. They realize that there are these kind of weird circular things that have these diamonds inside of them. And so they draw the conclusion that this must be powering the ship. And so it seems that this giant man is to desperately want to go on and find these necklaces to power up his ship. And so it's like, why have to go on and chase after these certain people? Maybe because only certain diamonds will work for his ship. Who knows? It's kind of a weird, goofy way to do all of this, but it is what it is. So, but that must have been the reason why the giant attacked Nancy like he did. So, Jess and the sheriff are to run because they realize that the giant is coming after them. So, both of them run outside the ship, and we have the sheriff who's just kind of blasting away at this giant. It's really doing nothing. No matter what he uses, his handgun, shotgun, nothing's working. So, we have the giant that just goes on to take these two people's car. He kind of looks through it and then just destroys it, and then goes back into his ship. So the sheriff realizes the radio is down, and then they're just gonna have to hoof it back into town. The doctor talks about Nancy's life as Nancy is to finally wake up and she sounds like she's in a tunnel, or that she's just to have a weird echo going on. I guess that's how, like, giant people sound. They have, like, an echo. It's very weird. So, the nurse is to, of course, call the sheriff, and she gets the deputy instead. The deputy is to find Harry at Tony's club. And so, whatever the deputy does here, Harry has no real interest in hearing the deputy out. He's just telling him, like, hey, like, tell them that I wasn't here, like, come up with some reasoning. And we even have the deputy is like, well, like, I want you to leave because it's an emergency. And Harry is just like, sure, I'll be right there. And then he goes right back to dancing with Honey, and he could care less. The doctors were lucky enough that they were somehow able to medicate Nancy, but are very unsure how long the medication is really going to last. As all of a sudden, we have the nurse, when the doctors are trying to make a phone call, the nurse tells the doctors that Nancy is awake again. And so we have the doctors who I believe were trying to call, or had called the deputy to tell them that Nancy was awake. And so, yeah, so when they try to call them again to try to get the deputy to come down here to drive them out of this place. So Nancy is to finally awake and break all of her chains and get free from her house as she crashes through it. And Nancy is just now making her way into town. We have some random old guy and a goat who are to all of a sudden notice Nancy, and they just run off. Nancy is to try to pull this electrical tower, or of course, if you it's a power lines. Like, I'm trying to figure out the rational way to say whatever the heck this thing is. So she tries to pull at it, and all of a sudden we have Harry and Honey, who is at the Tony's Club, and they're starting to realize that the electricity is to go out. The guy behind the bar is to run to get this candle to light this for Harry and Honey, but by the time he lights it, the lights come back on, so that's kind of a waste. So Nancy tries, or no, so Nancy sees a couple in their car making out, and so the couple all of a sudden sees Nancy, and they're like, oh my god. So they run off, and so immediately they end up finding the sheriff, the deputy, and all these people who are to try to figure out this situation for Nancy. And so Nancy starts to destroy pieces of the sign of the hotel, as the doctor realizes she will tear up the town trying to look for Harry. It's like, well, yeah, you think. So the sheriff tells the deputy to get Harry and kind of hide him somewhere, as the sheriff is to try to figure out a way to distract Nancy instead of having her possibly tear up the town. So now Nancy shouts, and so Harry and Honey are like, man, it sounds like somebody's yelling for your name. Who could this be? So the deputy is to try to run into the Tony Club to try to tell Harry what's going on. And we start to see that Nancy's hand is going inside the Tony Club. So we have the deputy who can't rationally want to go on and shoot Nancy's hand, but so Harry takes the gun from the deputy and starts shooting into Nancy's hand. So now Nancy is just ticked because she can't see what she's grabbing. She feels like she wants to get Harry. She's wasting too much time, because Nancy was to leave her house, and she's like, well, I know Harry's with that woman. He's at this club. I know where he's going. I know his, I know the way he thinks. So she knows where he is. So we have Nancy that tears off the roof of this place, and certain pieces would go on and go flying as certain people are kind of ducking and covering. So we have Honey, who's kind of hiding under this, I think, this table, and there are certain heavy pieces of wood that are to fall on top of Honey and crush her and kill her. So after Honey is now dead, Nancy is to grab Harry as the sheriff tries to fire upon Nancy. His firing ends up hitting against this power line, this electrical tower, and that explodes and electrocutes both Nancy and Harry, and that leaves the both of them now dead. And so when the doctors make their way to Nancy and Harry's body, they just come to this conclusion that wraps up the movie of like, well, hey, like, Nancy finally did get Harry all to herself in the end because she went on and killed off Honey to do so. But yeah, so they somewhat lived happily ever after, even though Harry at some point in time was plotting to kill his wife. And so that'll be a really interesting way to live in the afterlife if Nancy is still chasing after Harry even when they are dead. When Harry had no real interest in honestly Nancy, he just wanted to go on and be rich and be with Honey. So with that said, I'm going to try to get out of here to try to make this video as short as possible. Let me know in the comments below how you felt about Attack the 50-Foot Woman. Maybe there are certain versions of a 50-foot huge thing that you, of course, are to like, and maybe at some point I will cover those. Let me know in the comments below what that could possibly be, and maybe I will hopefully get to it, as long as it's something that is to hopefully be in English, or is to also be something that I can even find myself with all the bootleggish means that I have. So with that said, goodbye everybody. Bye everybody.